Dracula is the most famous vampire of all time. And he's going to be in your story? That's awesome. Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897. That means that the Count is now in the public domain, which means he's free to use for your vampire project. That means that he can be the main villain, or he can just make a cameo, or he can be a shadowy background character that's rarely seen, or he can be the hero. So, in this month of May, which includes World Dracula Day, let's talk about what the Count might be getting up to in your vampire project. And before we discuss that, you can see what Dracula is up to in my vampire project because he appears in this month's issue of the Crimson Moon Society, which includes a story about a siege on Castle Dracula, and also Dracula's very first greatest vampire romance, in a tale about his lost bride. So you can pick that up at the link below. It's 99 cents, and if you buy it, it helps this channel. That's very nice of you. Thank you very much. Now, let's talk about you and the Count. It is not hyperbole to say that Dracula is one of the most adapted characters in literature and pop culture. The original novel by Stoker has been adapted into numerous movies, comic books, just other versions of books. But also, the character has been used in countless other stories that are not adaptations of the book Dracula, where he has appeared as either a main character or a side character or a background character. And he is up there with the number of appearances of, like, Sherlock Holmes and Robin Hood and King Arthur. So let's talk about some of the ways that he's been used already and see if that sparks any ideas for you. Now, most storytellers tend to want to tell either a prequel to Dracula or a sequel to Dracula. If we're talking about prequels, some examples would be the book Dracula by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. And I talked with Dacre Stoker in one of my very first episodes, and he discusses the book, amongst many other fascinating Dracula discoveries that he's made. But Dracula basically follows the period of time that leads up to the events of Dracula. Another example would be the movie Dracula Untold by Legendary Pictures, where Luke Evans portrays Vlad the Impaler back in the 1400s and his war with the Turks. And we get to see how he becomes a vampire. And on that subject, you actually have a bit of a choice with your portrayal of Dracula. And that is, do you tie him into the very historical person of Vlad Dracula the Impaler? That's entirely up to you. And the reason for that is that Bram Stoker did not actually base his Count Dracula off of Vlad the Impaler. He got the name from Vlad the Impaler, and we have now learned that he did do some research about Dracula. But in the book Dracula, when Dracula is giving his own origin story, the facts of the story do not match with the actual history of Vlad the Impaler. In fact, Hans de Roos has discovered that the backstory that Dracula gives for himself is actually more closely aligned to that of a person named Michael the Brave, who is a completely different historical figure, a Transylvanian ruler from history. So ultimately, you don't have to have Dracula be the same person as Vlad the Impaler, because Stoker didn't. But that's entirely up to you. And certainly, for any of us who have seen Coppola's movie or, any of the stuff that has come since, it is perfectly fine and very satisfying to associate Count Dracula with Vlad the Impaler. So there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to. But if you're going to be doing a prequel about Dracula, sort of the elephant in the room is the question of, how did Dracula become a vampire? Because Bram Stoker never actually tells us in the book. It's left a mystery. So this has become sort of an obvious sort of wonderful problem to find a solution to for people who write stories about Dracula's origin. And it can be almost anything. So in your story, he could have been turned by another vampire, an older vampire. He could have just risen from the grave based on the weight of his own sins, or because he was such a violent person in life. He could have been cursed by a witch. He could have been cursed by the church. He could have learned how to become a vampire when he studied in the Scholomance, which is the school of black magic that Van Helsing mentions in the book Dracula. Maybe he read a dark book that somehow stained his soul or something like that. Something like the Necronomicon or the Darkhold, Book of Vile Darkness, something like that. So these are all options or ideas that can go into how he became a vampire. But you are not obligated to tell us how Dracula became a vampire. And certainly if you don't, you are following in the footsteps of greatness, because when we read Dracula, we're left with that mystery. And that's maddening. And that's a great place to leave your readers. Now, if you happen to be writing a sequel to Dracula in any regard, and a lot of people have done this, again, Dacre Stoker and his writing partner Ian Holt wrote Dracula the Undead, which is a sequel that sort of picks up a decade or two after the events of Dracula. There was also a book that I read back in college called Mina by Marie Kirali, which I think you can still find on Amazon in paperback form, that follows Mina's story after the events of Dracula, where she's trying to come to grips with everything that happened, and perhaps the ghost of Dracula is still haunting her. And this gets into sort of the exciting part about writing a sequel to Dracula, is that you need to decide how exactly Dracula comes back from the dead. Because, and sorry if I'm spoiling the end of Dracula for you, but the vampire hunters kill Dracula. But as Dacre pointed out in the interview that I did with him, that Dracula is not killed by the means in which Van Helsing says in the book are necessary in order to slay a vampire. There is no stake through the heart, there is no beheading. He gets his neck cut open, he gets a knife in his heart, and then he just turns into dust and blows away. So, is he dead? Or is that an escape? In which case he's totally fine and hanging out. So that that is entirely up to you, and it can really be any answer as to what he's doing back. But one of the interesting things about this is that you not only have Dracula as a character to figure out in a sequel, but you can also have access to all of the other characters in the book of Dracula. So, there are numerous people who have done, descendants of the Harkers or of Van Helsing, whether it be, in Marvel's Tomb of Dracula by Marv Wolfman, or Monster Force, which is an action figure line that's out right now. Vampirella has a descendant of Van Helsing in it. So these are Silver. We just did a whole interview with Stefan Frank that has, references to the Harker's estate in that. So there are all kinds of threads that are left loose at the end of Dracula that you can kind of pull on and figure out what direction everything went in. And ostensibly, any story that you tell is going to be a prequel or a sequel to Dracula in some sense. But there are plenty of stories where Dracula just sort of appears as a character separate from, really any events tying him to the original book. There is actually a movie that exists called Billy the Kid Meets Dracula. That's a real thing. And that's totally silly. But you've also got Dracula in the novel The Historian, where he's sort of background force that is trying to seed evil back into the world. Or you've got Dracula makes a cameo in the comic book series Planetary, where he is assigned by sort of a dark brotherhood sort of organization to basically shadow Sherlock Holmes and make sure that he doesn't turn against this brotherhood or say too much to the wrong person. He also appears in the 4-issue comic book series Dracula versus King Arthur, where he attempts to take over Camelot. You've also got him in Blade 3, which, you know what? Never mind about that one. And in almost every one of these examples, Dracula is the villain, or the antagonist. But what about situations where Dracula is actually a hero? So like, for example, in the anime Hellsing, Alucard, or Dracula, is sort of a weapon that has been harnessed by the Hellsing organization to fight other supernatural villains and other vampires, which is super cool. Or you've also got NBC's Dracula, where Jonathan Rhys-Meyers is the main character trying to avenge the death of his wife against the Order of the Dragon. And he even teams up with Van Helsing in this show. Which, P.S., I love this show. And I know that so many people hate it, and I'm totally fine with that. But one of the great things about it is that they took the characters from the book and they went off in some very interesting creative directions, and even sort of changed some origin stories, changed some of the characters and their relationships to one another to a way where I almost like the characters in the show better than in the book in some instances. So please don't come for my Dracula card. It's just my heart has spoken, and that's the way it is. Now, you may already have some idea about how you want Dracula to be in your story, whether he's a main character or side character. But let's talk for just a minute about what kind of a character he's going to be. Because Dracula has a lot of nuance. And I don't just mean that he can be both the villain and the romantic lead at the same time, like Gary Oldman's portrayal. But what I mean is that in the book, Van Helsing describes Dracula as having once been a great man and a genius. And when he was at the Scholomance, there was no topic of study that was forbidden to him. He was a warrior and a leader of men who led Christian armies against the Ottoman Turks. But Van Helsing also describes Dracula as an evil being who is trying to spread his vampire empire to England. And we do witness him turn Lucy and as well as Mina. And then there's, all the people that he killed on the Demeter and, the baby that he fed to his brides and then the mother of that baby, which he feeds to the wolves. And so we have plenty of direct witness stuff in the book to know that Dracula is the villain. But in Romania, Vlad the Impaler is remembered as a hero. He's a folk hero of the people who, during his reign, stamped out corruption amongst the nobility. And he protected Transylvania in various times from both the Ottoman Turks and the Hungarian Christians, who were essentially using Romania as a battleground proxy war for their larger war. He was a knight of the Holy Order of the Dragon, which was a Christian knighthood, but he was also raised in the palace of the Sultan, the same Sultan who he was fighting against, because as a child, he and his younger brother Radu were child hostages of the Sultan in order to make sure that Dracula's father stayed loyal to the Ottoman Turks. So Dracula learned the customs, the culture, the language of the Ottomans to the point where he could regularly be in disguise and no one would know the difference. A tactic that he employed on more than one occasion. And he impaled his enemies, but he also funded the construction of monasteries. He forced the wealthy nobility into essentially slavery of hard labor to build his castle. But at the same time, he also gathered all of the homeless together into a big feast hall and then burned them alive in it. He was the ruler of Romania 3 different times. He was also the prisoner of the Hungarian king for 14 years. So, both Vlad the Impaler, as well as Count Dracula, are both larger-than-life characters, but they are characters with extensive histories that help to determine not only their motivations, but also their actions. So, how will Dracula be portrayed in your story? Is he going to be the overarching villain, like in Dracula 2000? Or is he going to be the protagonist, like in NBC's Dracula? Is he going to be a weapon for good, like in Hellsing? Or will he be a mourning romantic, like in Castlevania? A despondent king of the vampires that is still too powerful for his subjects to overthrow? Or will he be an elusive wanderer, a legendary figure to vampires but rarely glimpsed, an absent monarch whose presence is both feared and missed by those who once knew him, like in Vampire Hunter D? Is he hateful of the living? Or is he enthralled by them? Is he a dark romantic? Or the lord of a vampire harem? Is he straight? Or is he gay? Or is he bi? Or is he pansexual? Or does he only derive sensuality from the drinking of blood in all of its nuance? Is he ravenous in his appetites? Or is he discerning? Does he rise above the primal needs of other vampires? Or is he the most primal of beasts? Does he command servants? Or does he prefer solitude? Does he seek to influence the affairs of men? Or does he have political ambitions? Or are his plans more supernatural in nature? Does he have children? Are they living? Or are they half vampires like Alucard? Are there any vampires that Dracula has sired? Does he still lair in a castle? Or does he now live in a Manhattan penthouse? Where does he sleep during the day? Is it a box of earth? Or is it an ancestral sarcophagus? Or is it a high-tech security coffin with internet connection and surveillance feeds running into it? Are his sensibilities still rooted in the medieval period? Or have his opinions grown with the times? Is he reformed? Is he worse? Can he love? These are all the questions that only you can answer, and that only your characters can discover over the course of your vampire project. So tell us about your vampire project that Dracula is going to be a part of. You can do that down in the comments. We would love to know about it. Many of the images used in this video were taken from Lucy X Mina, which is a movie that I'm going to be releasing this summer right here on YouTube on this very channel. If you happen to be watching this a little bit later, then I'll put a link to it right here. It has amazing performances in it by Gabriella Bijou, who plays Mina, and Megan Reese, who plays Lucy. And of course, throughout this whole episode, you've been seeing the incomparable Jordan Bijou as Dracula, who is just mwah. So I can't wait for you guys to see Lucy X Mina and hear what you think about it. The Crimson Moon Society is available through the link below on Amazon, and the May issue, like I said, is all brand new stories about Dracula. So, as we celebrate World Dracula Day, let's raise a glass of something red to the Count, and the version of him that appears in your vampire project. We'll see you next time.